Okay, so let's dive in. We're going to basically in this next video take an in-depth look at what the workflows are in SoundMiner, how to use them, and we're going to literally go through every single workflow that's available to you and at least get a basic understanding of what it's capable of doing. In the next video after that, we'll start building some more compound workflows and seeing the real power of these building blocks. But in this video, I want to just talk about the concept of what the workflows are, guide you through the window, understand the parts of it, and then have a look at all the individual parts. So let's dive in. So the first thing we need are some files. So as we look at these workflows and what they can do, we're going to need something to sort of test them on to understand what they're doing. So I've made just a duplicate of the same file over and over again. I've just called them test 1, 2, 3, 4, copy 1 through 6. This is fine. We just need something to sort of work with. I'm going to switch to a view that puts the file name right in the middle. And then I think I'm going to come in here to my fonts and just increase this a little bit, make this a little bit easier to read. So as we work on this file name, we're able to really see what the workflows do as we start to sort of manipulate this a bit. So there we go. I think that'll make it a little easier to see. Let's first call up the workflow window. You get to it by coming down here and picking this icon that's in between the hammer and wrench and the hand, and it'll open the workflow window, and it looks like this. If you're not familiar with this, we're going to talk about every part of it. So in the top left button is a clear button, so it will actually just clear all the workflows that you're using. It's just kind of like a reset button. I'm already blank, so it doesn't really do anything. On the left are the actual workflow blocks. I'm going to basically go ahead and make this window a little bit bigger so you can see that there's quite a few of them. I mentioned in the introduction that some of these exist on our Google Drive, a handful of them like separate 3 items. This is not one that's built into SoundMiner, but it's still a useful one we're going to show off. So if you find that you're missing a couple of these, go to our Google homepage in the Utilities folder, SoundMiner Workflows, and you can actually download them, and it explains there where they go. They basically go in your application support folder. There's a folder here called Workflows. So if you open your V5 application support folder, there's a folder here called Workflows. And you'll see that that's where these additional workflows are that I'm talking about that are up on our Google Drive. All the rest of these are built into SoundMiner, but these are these 5 additional ones that I use. And so if you want to use those, you're welcome to download them and drop them into this folder. So before we dive into this full list of workflows and look at what each of them can do, let's just get our heads wrapped around what the workflow sort of represents and how you use it. So think of these as sort of small building blocks of scripting tools in a way. So each of them can do different things. So let's just pull out a real simple one which says assign categories. So you pull it out from the left and you simply drop it onto the window to the right. And within this now I can sort of perform some actions. So if I click this, I can basically say assign the files to boats airboat. Now, nothing's going to happen until I actually try to run this workflow, and nothing will happen if I don't have some files selected. So right now, hit run, nothing's going to happen because there's no files selected for it to work on. The logic here is that by hitting run, it affects whatever files are selected. So just as a quick test, I can select these files, and when I hit run, it's basically going to, you'll see, go ahead and assign the category boats and airboats. This workflow simply assigns categories and subcategories, and it does so from the predefined sort of UCS list that's sort of built into SoundMiner. So I could just change my mind and say, okay, these are now communications telephones, and when I run it, it'll simply overwrite the other one. I can come here and choose anything I want. So this is at its basic functionality. What a workflow does is it performs some action. It's similar to right-clicking various parts in SoundMiner and saying find and replace. It sort of replaces the old admin window for setting fields to a certain thing. And you'll see as we get into sort of the compound function of what you can do, the real power of it. And what I mean by compound is that I'm not limited to run this block. I can simply drag out as many of these things as I want and build an entire sequence. So I'm calling these, and I don't think Justin necessarily calls them these, but I'm calling these sort of compound workflows. And we're going to look at this much more in the next video, and especially later when we start manipulating libraries. But what you can see is you can drag a whole lot of workflow blocks out. You can also rearrange them. So I can click and drag this down. I can sort of rearrange the order, and it works top to bottom. So it's going to perform these in the order that they're basically appearing. So it'll first attempt to do this block, and then it moves to the next one, then it moves to this one, then it moves to this one, etc., all the way down. So ignore what these blocks are doing. This is a jumbled mess at the moment, but you get the idea that we're building this sort of script from top to bottom. One of the really useful ones that Justin added for me recently is comment. And if you're really starting to work with these, and especially if you're going to export a workflow for somebody else, comment is pretty cool because it enables you to just type a comment. This step does this, right? And I can drag another one out. You're not limited to one of each. You can drag as many as you want. So let's say I can kind of divide this workflow into blocks, and then this happens, right? I can type comments to myself to remember what I'm doing in a various chunk or what the block is doing for somebody else. So comment is a really useful workflow, and you can add as many of these as you want to sort of break this apart. Again, comment has no effect other than simply to remind you what the next step or what the previous step is doing. That's why it's marked nice and yellow too, to make it really stand out. So, okay, I have all these workflows out here, and before we start diving into each of them, let me just point out what you can do up here. Let's say I've built this really elaborate compound workflow, and I don't want to lose it. It might be quite useful, especially if you're a vendor. Let's say you go through the time of what we're going to do today of building out a workflow to sort of convert a library. Well, at some point, you're going to want to save this workflow, and you can simply come here to File, Save As, and I can call this like test01, right? And I can save that. It's now saved so that if I clear this, I come back to my preset window and you'll see here it is. I can hit test01 and it recalls everything exactly as I had it. So good idea to get in the habit of saving these. If I came in here now and I made some change to this, I can simply go back to File and hit Save test01. It'll overwrite basically. It doesn't prompt me a warning, so be careful, but it's now replaced that. So again, I clear it. Now I call it back and you'll see that extra step is there. You can also basically import and export these compound workflows. So again, I'm calling them compound workflows just because they're multi-step. Maybe call them multi-step workflows. So let's say this was this brilliant workflow and I wanted to share it with some people. I can come here and I can say export the current workflow. Basically prompts me to give it a name. I can put it right on the desktop, test01 workflow. Now I can clear that. I can even, or let's say I can select this workflow again. I can now come here and actually say delete this, right? I don't want it anymore. So it still left it here, but actually deleted it out of the preset list. So if I clear this, now it's no longer there, right? But I exported it, so let's see what happens. So I can go to import, go back to my desktop, point to it, and you'll see it'll come in with all these steps. Now, one thing to be aware of here is that it didn't actually save this as a preset. It's not going to appear over here, but it did load it into the current view. So now if I wanted to actually keep it in workflows, I'd have to go ahead and save it now. Hit Save As, right? The second I hit clear, it's lost again because I didn't actually go through the process of saving it. So now you get the idea of what the workflow sort of window represents. So let's go through one by one and really break down all of these workflows, and then we'll come back to start building them out into sort of compound workflows. Okay, well, let's dive into the workflows one by one and see what they're capable of doing. So we just start going in order. The first one, if I drag it out, is simply add or remove characters. So let's look at the file name. This workflow can either remove a certain number of characters from the beginning or the end of a field, can keep a certain number of characters from the beginning or the end, so it's sort of like a truncate function, or it can insert a number of characters at the beginning or the end. So remove 4 characters from the beginning of the file name. When I hit run, I'll do it to all of these a little easier to see, right? It removes the word test because it's 4 characters long and it's gone, right? Remove 4 characters from the end, remove characters from the end. Now you'll see it starts adding this -1 through 5 because it removed all the characters and it would have been basically an identical file name. So it starts to basically preserve the file name how it has to by adding this 1. Let's say we want to keep 4 characters from the beginning of the file name. So now it's going to truncate everything backwards. Again, we're going to have a duplicate file name situation, so it's going to add this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But you see, it tried to keep the word test because it basically just kept the 4 characters from the beginning of the file name. And lastly, insert characters, 4 characters from the beginning of the file name. We'll put 4 spaces into the file name, just like that. 4 spaces at the end, you can see, just like that. So a pretty useful one, especially for the ability I find to remove a certain number of characters from the beginning or end of a file name. Append and prepend is something that I use constantly. And prepend, put something at the very beginning, append, add to the end. So append something to the end of the file name. So I want to add some more text. I want to add underscore t and none. So I want to basically go ahead and add that to the end. You see, it just tags it to the end of those files. This button here, skip it, exists already. So without this, if I run the workflow and then I run it again, you'll see that basically it'll just keep adding them as many times as I want. If I check this box and try to run it again, it won't do anything because the end of the file name to the dot is already this exact phrase, so it realizes I don't want to do it again. Prepend does exactly what it says. Put that at the very beginning of the file name, right? So quite often I'm using this to prepend something. In the old days, before we had sort of these really nice tools to do it, I might do something like this, ambience public place. I might prepend to this to the beginning of the file name as a way to sort of assign a cat ID just like that. So that's append and prepend, very useful. Assign artwork from volume. When the workflow runs, it'll prompt you to find a piece of artwork and go ahead and assign it to the files. So you can build this into a complex workflow if you wanted to. It's the same as right-clicking and saying assign artwork to selection. That will also prompt you for the file. So it's just available in the workflow form. So assign categories we sort of glanced at, but again, you can assign a UCS category to the file or files, whatever is selected, and running it will basically fill in category, subcategory. It will also, if I switch to a slightly different view, assign category ID and category full. So if I just undo that and run it again, you'll see that it's not only doing category, subcategory, it's doing all 4 of these at the same time. Cat ID, category, subcategory, category full. Now, auto split is a really interesting one, and I use it all the time for basically breaking apart certain parts of one field into another. Basically, it's going to look for capitalization changes in a string of text that doesn't have spaces. So in order to sort of see what this is doing, let's come up here and let's prepare something a little bit different. Let's call this test new showing title case, like this, okay? So if we decide to auto split this, I can auto split from one category right back to itself. So I can say auto split the file name to the file name. And when I run it, what you'll see is that it found every capitalization change back to an uppercase, assumed that it's a new word, and went ahead and insert a space there. Now, one other thing to be aware of that it will actually do as well, if I have a dash here, and I'll just run down this one, when I auto split this, we'll also convert dashes to spaces. So it doesn't, and it will also remove underscores. So if I come in here and I add some underscores and some dashes, and I hit enter, when I auto split this, it will basically remove the underscore, replace with a space, remove the dash, replace with a space, etc. So this is a very quick way to sort of clean up a string of text with either no spaces or underscores or dashes and convert them back into spaces. And I'm using this one quite a bit. And in fact, some of the workflows when that break apart the file name into the effects name, for example, use the auto split to basically deal with a situation like this where there may not be spaces to create them. So again, if I just run this, you'll see that very quickly I can tidy up that and basically create spaces where there weren't spaces before. So next we have change case, something I use all the time as well, a way to simply change the casing of a string of text. So we'll go to the file name again, and we'll just say uppercase. And now when I run that on all these, you'll see that it just uppercases them all. If I create title case, it'll basically do that. Lowercases them all. Capitalize the first letter, basically capitalizes the first letter at the very string of this. Capitalize only the first letter, just guarantees that it's only capitalized in the first letter. I think they basically work more or less the same. And capitalized sentences won't have any effect here because I don't have any extra periods. But if I came in here and I put like this and had a period, now capitalized sentences will basically find that period and start of a new sentence and capitalize that as well, if that makes sense. Code execute is well above my pay grade, and it's useful for people who are much smarter than I am. But basically, you can run code directly from within a workflow. So if you knew how to use Lua, you knew how to use other programming languages that were available, I don't know exactly which ones are allowed here, you could actually type a string of very complex code and have it run here as well. I want to begin to try and describe when it would be useful because I don't know. But Justin has written this for some very specific purposes, and it is available. So if you're that clever, you could actually execute code right from within a workflow. So copy first record is kind of cool. It basically, let's say you went through the hassle of, adding in some information for a bunch of these things. I'm just going to type a few things just to show off what this one can do. So selecting them all and choosing which categories you want to copy basically will copy literally the fields from the first selected record and paste them downwards, so in through my selection. So if I hit run on this, basically effects name isn't an option in this list, so it didn't do that, but it did take the category, the subcategory, the designer, the show, and library, and just copied them down. So if you had one file, one record in your database that was as you wanted it and a whole bunch right below it that you wanted to sort of quickly copy some things to, you could easily do that with this workflow. Copy folder name will basically take the name of the folder that these files are in and allow you to copy it somewhere. So I can say copy the folder name and put it to, let's put it in effects name because we don't have anything there we care about. So you see that these files are all in a folder that's literally called UCS test names, which is exactly where I'm storing them. You can see that by looking over here on the Finder that these are the files right here. So all it did was take the folder name and paste it there. I could also copy, append, things like that. So let's undo that and say, let's go work on the file name. And let's say, let's prepend the folder name directly in front of the file name. So now I've taken that folder name and pasted it here. So let's say in the case of the Game Developer Conference stuff, you don't have any designer field and there's no designer in the file name, sort of no clue about who owned these files. Well, they might very well be in a folder that's based on the designer name. So you could simply copy the folder name here and copy it to designer, for example. And designer is way up here. And you might get lucky. And again, if the folder name was actually the designer, here's an easy way to sort of steal the designer out of the path and paste it here. Copy multi-level folder name does the same thing, but grabs the folder and the parent folder above that. So I think what's most useful, again, and this was designed around the GDC stuff as a demo, would be to take the parent folder, put it in designer, to put it into library, which I think was likely, and the grandparent folder was going to end up the designer. So if you had a folder that sort of came in and it said boom / epic explosions / and then the files, you could use this workflow to sort of steal both a library and the designer out of the path and paste it into a field, which you could then use to sort of build a file name or to do something else with it later. So this works on just 2 levels of the path, basically to extract some information. Date can basically append or prepend the date in the format that you have here. Always tell it to use the current date, and you can simply paste it somewhere else. So I could basically append the date to the end of my file names. Useful like that to guarantee probably that there's no recurring or overlapping file name somewhere else in your library. You could also basically first, when we look at the compound things, add a dash or something like that. So again, maybe useful if you want to use the date somewhere in the file name. This is a way that you could do that. Embed does exactly what it says. It just, at that point in the workflow, it embeds those records. So if I run this, basically it went ahead and embedded the current set of metadata, which is nothing, but it embedded it into those files. So a useful one to add at the end of a compound workflow just to make sure that you don't lose that work. But also a little bit of a dangerous one in that the second that it happens, you're overwriting the metadata that may have been there. So be careful of using it. Useful when you need it, but dangerous if you're not aware of what it might be doing. So I rarely put it into the workflow. Usually I want to run the workflow, see what the metadata is doing. Once that's done, I simply have a hotkey on my keyboard to embed the metadata at that point. Field build, a super useful one. In order to sort of show it off, we probably need to do a couple things. I'm going to basically set a couple of fields to test, and I'm going to set the effects name to 1, 2, 3, 4. And let's set the category to air. So field build is really useful for basically building one field out of a set of other fields and or text and or things. So let's just clear this for a second. This over here is the length of the field you're about to build. I would put this up pretty high unless you intentionally wanted it to be a short sort of truncation. Defaults to 31, so be careful of that. Every time you pull it out, you probably want to add some length to that. So let's say we want to build a file name, and we want to use, to build it, some of these other fields and or some text. So the way you designate a field that exists in the database is to use the sort of less than and greater sign symbols, and then you type the actual name of the field. So let's start with category. So if I type like this, if I just run this at this point, you get air, and then it starts to see a duplicate file name because it's trying to build the exact same thing, so it adds this. So let's undo that. Let's say I want to then have the category go directly into the subcategory. So I type subcategory, and again, another little bracket at the end. And now I run this, and you see that it puts air test, right? It puts these things together. Now it literally just put them directly together because I don't have anything in between. What I could do is add, a series of spaces. So now when I run it, you see that it basically puts these spaces in it as well. So in addition to field building actual other fields, you can basically put in text. So So with the space in front of it. So now I run this and I get basically air and test, right? Category air and the word and test. And again, you can field build this sequence into anywhere else. So you could build a compound category full, right? So that would be another easy way to sort of do category full. If we didn't have scripts that automatically did it, we could simply build category dash subcategory and we would have a category full. File path extractor is a sort of variant or a more complicated version of the copy folder name and copy multi-level folder name. What it allows you to do is sort of look through the entire path, break it apart into separate variables based on the sort of folders, and then copy a certain chunk of that into a certain place. So, for example, separate the file path into an array, then take the first. So if I look down here, volumes, sky, UCS. So let's say take the first item from the front, in this case, that should be volumes, and put it into the effects name. And when I run it, that's exactly what I get, right? Now, if I wanted to pull out of here the word sky, that's the second, basically, part of the file path, so I could put that, and there I get sky. Or I could sort of do the equivalent of this copy folder name and say, take the first from the end and put it in there, and what I should now get is UCS test names, because that's the next folder up from the actual file. And that's exactly what I get. No, actually, I get the actual file name. So the file path breaking into an array, the file name actually becomes the very last one. So in this case, I'd want to take the second from the end and paste it, and now I'll get the UCS test names. The next one is find and place, and this is a really useful one. It's basically a variant of find and replace. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a find and replace first, and then we'll come back to these other two. So find and replace is exactly what you think it is. So enter the file name, find the word test, and replace with the word dog, right? And when I run it, basically just find and replace. So if you know how to use regex, which I don't, you could do some really complicated sort of scripting in here to find like the fourth syllable or the fourth part of a word or something like that. So otherwise ignore regex. It's a complicated and sort of very difficult thing for my brain to wrap itself around. But it is available to use in certain workflows, and it allows you to do some really clever stuff. Some of the workflows we have that Justin's helped write, because he understands it, can do some very powerful things that would be a little bit difficult to do without it. But for the average user, you probably aren't that interested in it. So that's find and replace. You can do it in any field, and I'm using this constantly to sort of find one thing and replace one thing. Find test and replace with an uppercase test, right? I could find, let's say I wanted to change all these numbers from 01 through 06 to 11 through 16. Well, I could find space 0 and replace with space 1, and that would basically accomplish that. So in order to make sense of this one, find and replace word, I need to have a word present that's also present in another word, but that other word is longer. So before we do that, I'm going to do something simple here, and I'm going to find and replace, and I'm going to find and replace title with the word testing. Okay, and I'm going to do that in the file name, and you'll see why in a second. So now I have the word test and the word testing, right? So if I go to here and tell it to replace test with cow, for example, you'll see that it replaces it not only here, but it technically found the word test at the beginning of testing, and so it went and replaced it here as well. Well, this is often not what you want, and it gets a little complicated. What you'd have to do is then duplicate this and say, okay, now basically fix that by putting cowing back to testing, right? So this is a way I could get around it, but there's an easier way, and that's to use the workflow that says find and replace word. This will basically only replace something if it's a self-contained word, and so when I run this now, it sees the word test as a separate word because of the spaces after it, but testing will not actually work for a replacement because it's not a self-contained word. So when I run that, now I just replace the word test, but not affect the word testing. So that's find and replace single word. Pretty useful for when you have this kind of situation where you have sort of the repeat of a word within another word and you want to preserve that. Find and place allows you to find something in one field and replace it with something in another field, or take that, put somewhere else. So find cow in the file name and replace the word test and put in the effects name. So take this entire field, copy it over here, but doing a find and replace in the process. So a pretty useful one for basically taking one field, modifying it a little bit, and pasting it somewhere else. Number is really nice for appending or prepending numbers to the end of a file. So in this case, I already have some, but let's say I want to add some more. So I can basically append, and let's say we want to start with the number 7 to the end of the file name and in this format 0000. So when I run it, it simply adds 0007, 0008, 0009, just follows the rules that are set here. Useful for adding a numbering sequence to a bunch of files to sort of make sure that they're unique. A lot of people like to do that on their file names. Useful for basically even in the effects names, if you have a bunch of the effects names that are the same. So even if I come over here and I say, I don't know, bridge collapse, right? I've got all these. Well, let's say I want to have a variant of those, bridge collapse 1 through 7. So I could start with 1 and in the format of 2 digits, append it to effects name. And it's going to not have a space here. I'd have to deal with that. But one way I could easily add a space, right? Insert 1 character to the end of the effects name. And now you start to get a sense of these compound workflows. This will basically create a space and then add that numbering scheme just like that. Process if is a pretty cool one. Basically, it queries something, and only if it matches this sort of rule does it continue the workflow. So if the file name starts with cow, then basically continue, right? If the file name starts with new, then continue. So let's say now assign the category to ambience amusement, right? So again, let's try this with this. If the file name starts with cow, then go ahead and continue on in our workflow. So if it starts with cow, go ahead and assign ambience amusement, which happens. If it starts with new, well, it doesn't. So the workflow basically stopped at that point. It didn't continue on to this step because the process if basically failed. It said, well, it doesn't start with that, so I'm going to just stop. So be aware that if you use this, it literally breaks the entire workflow from there on down. It won't pick up, it won't continue, it won't look for any way to resume. It's just a dead end. It's just it kills the workflow right there. So to show off this next one, which is remove multiple spaces, I went ahead and I added some extra spaces into the file names up here. So you see after cow, we've got like 4 or 5 spaces, and after new, there's at least 2. So a real easy way to tidy those up. And sometimes when you start field building and moving things around, you're left with these sort of multiple instances of spaces. So remove multiple spaces in the file name will simply find anything greater than 1 and reduce it to 1. That's all it does. So it won't remove the single space that it should have there, but it will remove any instances of 2 or more spaces and replace with a single space. So remove all occurrences of does exactly what it says. If I say remove the following characters, remove zeros. Basically, any 0 that it finds, it's going to remove from the file name. So I run it, and I'm left with everything that was left that's not a 0, right? I want to remove all the C's from my file name for some reason, right? Case loses it, cow loses it, and that's exactly what it does. So mostly useful probably for removing all instances of, say, an underscore or a dash or maybe a comma, things like that, an easy way. So again, this is very similar to doing a find and replace and leaving the replace blank. I'm not actually sure if there is even a difference. So if I bypass this, find all zeros and replace with nothing will basically have the same effect, right? Find all C's and replace with nothing basically has the exact same effect as this. There's probably some difference in the logic of how it works. I just don't know what it is. But this is certainly useful for finding all underscores or finding all dashes or finding all commas in a string, particularly a file name, and remove them all fairly quickly. So remove all trailing numbers will basically look at the end, and if the file name ends with a string of numbers, it'll try to remove them all. In this case, it's going to generate a bunch of duplicate file names, so what we're going to actually see is some numbers reappear, but if I run it, you'll see that it basically tried to remove them all. Now, it didn't attempt to remove that space that was in front of them, so be aware that you have, in this case, a trailing space left behind that you'd have to sort of deal with. Again, this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is only occurring because in the process of doing that workflow, it basically started to produce duplicate file names. So it has to create sort of a way to sort of allow that. So it just adds these in. But so if I name these files all with like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 at the beginning, and now I run this workflow, you'll see that it basically removed this string of numbers, but it did leave this space. So we'll get to a workflow in a minute that can tidy that up. Called remove, but for now you can see what that does. Let me undo that and say I can also tell it to remove one trailing number. So it's going to simply start removing one number at a time from the end. And so this would be a way to sort of simply run it a couple times to remove 2 numbers or whatever. You could do the same thing with the add and remove characters, which we already looked at, remove a certain number of characters from the end. But this is a quick way to sort of get rid of all numbers at the end of a file name, just like that. Remove words, very useful, again, especially for dealing with information in a field that you want to get rid of, whether it's at the beginning or the end. So in this case, let's remove 2 words from the end of the file name. Now, a word is basically any block of text separated by a space. So in this case, we'll remove this block of text and the word case, I believe, which it does. And it even removes the leading space up to that. So it's a quick way to sort of literally remove those. If I do it from the beginning, basically I should get rid of this and this. And it starts now with new showing testing case, right? So just a way to remove a certain number of words. Very similar to remove characters, but you don't have to know exactly how many characters the word is. So even if the words were of different lengths, so if this was crow, it doesn't rely on the length of the characters. It just looks for the actual word breaks. And so I can still remove those two just like that. Remove is a really useful one, and it has quite a few options, so be aware that it's not just remove spaces, but by default it comes up with remove spaces. So if I run this here, remove spaces, it basically just removes the spaces. If I remove inner vowels, basically it will remove all the inner vowels in the middle of a word, and it's a way to sort of create a really truncated version that still might be readable if you wanted to try it. So new showing, it's not that useful right here, but it might be useful for truncating a long description or something down into a file name or something like that. Remove numeric, again, just what it says, removes basically the numbers, but in this case, it creates some duplicate file names, so it does that. Remove leading and trailing spaces. Again, let's create some leading and trailing spaces to see. If I go to the beginning and I put some spaces at the beginning, and it looks like if there's more than one space, it has to run a couple of times. So it removes one of them. It's kind of assuming there's only going to be one leading or trailing space. So be aware of that. You might want to run it a few times, but if I keep running it now, it won't truncate any more of the spaces because they're not at the beginning or at the end. Remove duplicate words does exactly what it says. So if I have put here at the end new at the very end of that and run it, basically, it keeps the first one, but any other instances of that, it basically gets rid of. So at this point, if I come in here and I basically type like this, remove duplicate words should get rid of all of those and just leave this. Remove carriage returns, I guess removes actual carriage returns that wouldn't be visible, it wouldn't be easy for me to see. So I don't know what instance where you would actually want to use this, but if I ran that, it would basically remove a carriage return, which I'm assuming would be in there screwing up some other part of the scripting or something like that. Here, replace two or more spaces to a single space. So again, this is the equivalent of remove multiple spaces. But one thing that it will do is, if I was to do this at the very end of the file, right, it didn't actually remove the leading or trailing space, but every other instance of multiple spaces, it did truncate down at least to a single space. So what you could do is duplicate this and then remove leading or trailing spaces. So let me undo that. And if running these in sequence, we'll first find every instance of more than one space and at least get it down to one space. And then remove leading and trailing spaces should actually remove the leading and the trailing spaces. So the equivalent of this should be to tidy that up nicely. So run process script we're not getting into too much because it's sort of I won't call it buggy, but it has some quirks to it. It's a way to run a Lua script, or often called a metadata script, I guess, in SoundMiner, from within the workflows. It can be really useful, but be aware that any script that calls up a graphical UI element may not work very well with this. So for example, if I call up the one that says calculate duration, this is a script that basically if I select a bunch of files here and I right click and I say process metadata, calculate duration, it basically adds the time of all those together and tells me that the total of all these together is 4 minutes, 57 seconds. Something like that. Well, if I try to run that as a workflow, basically it doesn't work because it's calling up a UI element to give me that response, and that's just something this isn't capable of doing. But if you have a script that doesn't rely on graphical elements, then you can actually call them up and run them directly from within a workflow with this. But just be aware that you'll have mixed results depending on what and how complicated the script that it's trying to run actually is doing. I'm going to skip over separate three items for a second. We'll come back to it because it's a variant of the separate items script. So this one again is very useful. It basically takes a string of text, breaks it into an array based on whatever character you choose, and can then take one of those variables and paste it somewhere else. So we're going to look at the file name. We say separate the file name into an array, in this case using spaces to separate. So it's going to basically assign each of these spaced out chunks of text to a different variable. So think of them as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And take the second item, the word showing, and put it in the effects name, right? So, or take the fifth item in this array, which is this set of numbers, and put that over an effects name. So it's very powerful for sort of delving into a string of text. Again, if this was a file name that was separated by underscores, we could do this. And this is actually what the UCS extraction script is sort of based around, this idea. Break this sort of string of text into an array based on some separator. It could be a comma, a dash, or in our case, an underscore, which is what we're using in our file name sort of structure. And then take one of the things and put it into there. So you could very easily duplicate this, leave everything else the same, and say, okay, well, now take the third one and put that into category. So same thing is going to happen. It takes the file name, breaks it apart, but the third one, which is testing, should appear over here in category when I run this now, right? Oh, and I see what I did. I actually put this back to an underscore. Well, there is no underscore. So when it breaks the file name into an array using an underscore, it's basically filling nothing into the array. So when I then go to paste them, there's nothing there. So I have to go put this back to spaces. That's my mistake. And now when I run it, you'll see that it's taken the third item and placed it over here in category, and it's taken the fifth item and it's put it here in the effects name. So a really powerful one to be able to split things into multiple categories. I use this one constantly. A lot of the other scripts that sort of the UCS sort of is built around that Justin has written are sort of using variants of this. But this idea of breaking a string of text, separating it out based on something, a comma, an underscore, a space, and then being able to move some of those pieces around is very powerful. So now let's look at separate three items, which is basically a variant, I believe, written by Kai Paquin, which does the exact same thing, but allows you to sort of combine a certain number of the variables back into a single string. So take the file name, break it into array based on spaces, but now take the first, second, and third items, paste them to effects name, now separate them, let's say, by a dash. So what we should get is new dash showing dash testing when I run this, and that's exactly what we get. I can also take the first, the fourth, and the fifth, right, and run that, and now I get new, the first variable, case, the fourth one, and the string of numbers. Or if I wanted to separate it by a space, I could simply do that, or separate the target by a comma, right? Lots of options for basically manipulating and moving pieces of one field around to another. So separate last items is another variant. Basically, again, we'll separate the file name into an array using space, and then take the two or the second item from the end and put it into effects name. So what's the difference here? Well, let's say you know that you want to take this last one here and use this. So this is the first item from the end and put it in effects name. Well, the difference is that if I had a different number of words here, I mean, all of our file names here have the exact same number of words, but let's say I have some that have a different amount of words, right? Just arbitrarily changing the length of some of these. Well, if I wanted to use the basically separate items, the original one here, I could say separate the file name using a space, just like that. But now if I wanted this string, it's in a different location depending on which file name. So in this one, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's the sixth position. This would be the fifth position. This would be the seventh position. So this one, separate items, isn't going to be able to find that one very easily, right? That's where the separate last item comes in. Basically separate it the exact same way, split it into array, but now start counting backwards. So now take the first one from the end and put it in effects name. And you'll see that it basically does exactly that. If I clear this and run it, it's basically counting backwards, the first variable counting backwards. So in this case, if I took the second to the end, it should always get the word case. If I take the sixth one back, we're going to get different result, basically, because counting backwards from the end, the sixth position is actually different in these different file names. So being able to separate from the beginning or separating from the end is certainly useful for basically fishing out a piece of information out of one string of text. Okay, we're getting there. Set color is a pretty useful one. In order for it to work, you have to come over here and turn on colors. And colors is a column. And what you can do is you can say, set these files to this color. And I don't particularly use colors all that often, but it is useful from time to time to designate a certain type of file with a certain color. So if I was working on sort of finding some duplicates or something, I might set one set to a certain color, set one to another, and then sort by duration, for example, and watch what the colors are doing. And it might be a way to lead me to sort of find duplicates. It's just an organizational tool that you have available to you. And you can also come down here and hit, when you set remove and run, it'll basically remove the colors if you don't want to use them. I have these actually all hotkeyed to a Stream Deck icon, which is kind of interesting. So I can simply call up a set of colors and just hit a Stream Deck icon and color them all really quickly if I wanted to. I haven't found a use for it all that often, but occasionally it's been useful. Set field does exactly what it is. It's one of the more basic ones. Set the effects name to test, right? Run it on all of them. It does just exactly that. Now, it's not like field build. You can't type in an actual category here. You can't copy a field or another one in this. It's literally just set a field to a string of text. So useful to often come in here and do something like set designer to your name, right? For all the records that are there. When you run it, just does exactly that. Set rating. If you use ratings, you could say set all of these to a rating number 5. I don't really ever use ratings, but it is a field that you can call up. And if I call it up, now these have been set to rating 5. Set unique ID based on the file path is kind of an interesting one. It basically will, let's set it to effects name. And when you run it, basically, it's going to generate just a string of numbers that look like to be 8 characters long. And it's sort of a random number based on breaking apart the file path, which includes the file name. So it's a way for you to generate a completely unique string, which is very unlikely to basically be duplicated among another string. Maybe it's technically impossible. I don't know mathematically, but certainly we'll be generating a unique number that you could then, for example, append to the end of the file name if you wanted to guarantee that that file name was going to be absolutely unique, no chance of it being duplicated somewhere else in your database. That's a way to do it. Split and sort. I'm going to have to do a little work here to basically show what this is, but let's type the words zebra, comma, air, comma, door, comma, car, comma, umbrella, right? This is my file name. So split and sort on comma in the file name will basically break it apart and reorder them accordingly. So now I get air, car, door, umbrella, zebra in alphabetical order. So I don't really use this one very often either, but it's pretty clever. If you had some file names that were a string of keywords, for example, or you had some keywords in the keywords field and you wanted to just kind of reorder them to make them more legible and more readable, you could certainly use this to do that. So we're almost to the end. Take first words and take last words are ones that I remember asking for quite a while ago, and they're very, very useful to me. So what will often happen is you may not have something in a field and you want to use sort of part of another field. You could copy one field to the other and then try to figure out a way to truncate it. But in this case, let's take the first 4 words from the file name and make that our effects name, right? So it takes the first 4 words, literally, whatever they are, and puts it over here. A quick and easy way to build an effects name, if you have absolutely no other way to do it, may be to take the first, let's say, 6 or 7 words of the description. Again, for us, the effects name is sort of a short version of the description, so being able to take a certain number of words from one field and paste it somewhere else can often prove pretty useful. You also might want to, if you had a file name that was complete garble, you could say, take the first 8 words of the description and use that in building a new file name. You could paste it into a variable, something like that. That is something I didn't really mention up until now, is that you have available down here sort of 5 temporary fields. These are basically to be used for this type of situation where I could first say, take these first 4 words from the file name, put them into temporary 1. I could then do some additional action on the temporary 1 field without disturbing any of my other fields that are already built. So in a complex workflow, being able to assign things in and out of these temporary sort of placeholders is really, really useful and allows you to sort of manipulate them in a safe space. So I can come in here now and I could title case this temporary 1, or I could do a find and replace in it. Now, the one thing you'll notice is that you can't actually just call up the field temporary 1. It doesn't actually exist in a sort of a usable field. It's not meant to be used in that way. It's meant as a temporary sort of placeholder. So be aware that when you're doing some work on it in here, you won't really see the output unless you then take temporary 1 and put it somewhere back into a visible field. Take last words is exactly the opposite. Takes the 4 words from the end of file name and paste them in effects name. So whatever the last 4 things are, it's going to copy them and put them here. So exactly the same as take first words, but often, again, useful for some file names will come in that will have, let's say, 3 words that make up a microphone and a recorder at the end. And that's really about it. I'm not going to get into the UCS build and the UCS extract because later in the tutorial, we're going to look at these in much more detail. These are very complex workflows that were built exactly for the UCS system to be able to sort of build file names and extract things in and out of file names. So we're going to go into this much more in depth later in the tutorial. So we won't sort of cover that right here. And that's it. So we've sort of made our way through all of the workflows here. In the next video, let's start putting a few of them together to sort of see this notion of how you build sort of a complex or a compound workflow.